Chapter 11. Mornaport. Sade and Vondales followed the sails of ship on the trade routes because neither of them had ever had a lesson in navigation. Sade kept replenishing the mage wind hour after hour. He had never called upon his powers so much and was quickly learning that fatigue could come from the use of magic just as it could come from physical exertion. He slept stretched out on a thwart whenever he could. At night, they steered as close as possible to the other vessels in order to keep the faint glow of their sails visible in the moonlight. By dawn, they would distance themselves again, but never so far as to lose sight of the sails. Sade was thankful he had packed the waterskin because they would have died of thirst out on the salt sea for the 3 days it took them to spot land. When they had, it presented them with further decisions, like where to come ashore. "We could come ashore outside of town and hide the boat," Vondales said. But Sade differed. "How would we hide it? It's too big for us to haul on shore. It will be safer at the public dock." They had a few coins left between them that Sade hoped would pay at least a few hours on the port. He leafed through each of his books trying to decide which one he might sell. He hated to part with any of them, but they were the only things of value they had between them, and they needed to eat. Sade had not been so famished and weak with hunger since the days after their mother had died, and they had eaten scraps of their own clothing. He hoped to buy some fish tackle or even a crab pot and bait so that they might be able to feed themselves. It would be a meager existence, but it would provide them some sort of start towards self-sufficiency. They were not even sure of which island it was that they pulled into, but by the size and number of boats, at least 60, Sade guessed it was Greatport, the capital of the Rawis Isles, and the seat of government for the whole of the archipelago. A large city might be good to disappear in, he thought, but on the other hand, there would be no shortage of lawmen about to enforce order and give two murdering thieves pause. Whalers, cargo cutters, and fishing boats all rocked on the harbor's waves. Even far out on the water, Sade and his brother could hear the commotion of the port. It was so much bigger than anything they had ever seen before. The crush of people on the shore carrying crates, hauling nets, bartering and trading for goods, made the mob that followed them on Lennosport appear small and insignificant by comparison. "I never imagined there were so many people in the world," Vondales said from the bow, looking back at Sade, who was working the tiller. He let the mage wind drop, so as not to attract too much attention, and sailed into the harbor on the world's wind. But he soon found he lacked the skill required to dock their craft at the pier. He whispered a final incantation and pushed the craft close enough that a dockhand tossed a line to them. Vondales pulled them in the rest of the way, the dockhand's eyes lingering on the spellbook open across Sade's lap. "How much to dock?" Sade asked the dockhand as he closed the book. The dockhand was not much older than them, with just a feathering of a beard along his chin and under his nose. He responded in an accent that was so thick that Sade had to ask him to repeat himself. 90 pence, he said, slowly articulating the syllables. Sade haggled with him down to 45 if they left before sundown when the fishing vessels would return. Sade proposed that they shove off and simply sleep the night floating in the harbor. The dockhand was satisfied, took his 45 pence, and was off to tend to the other boats. Sade and Vondales were left on the dock feeling bewildered by the crowds of people, the strange accents, and the jumble of city buildings waiting for them on the shore. Food was their first priority, and Sade called back the dockhand and paid him an extra 2 pence for the information on the best places to buy food and fish tackle. The boy offered the names of a few shops, but again, his accent was so thick Sade barely caught the words. Instead, he continued down the dock, reluctant to ask the boy to repeat himself. Vondales kept close to Sade's heels as they made their way. Sade tried to look as if he knew where he was going. After all, a port was a port, and it shouldn't be too hard to find a trader selling fried fish or fresh bread from a booth. He could see some of the longshoremen eyeing them suspiciously as they neared the end of the dock. Sade told his brother to take his hand off the handle of the hatchet he had stuffed into his belt. "You don't see anyone else walking around that way. Be casual or we'll attract attention." They walked 3 piers over, Sade inquiring from sellers how much for a finger of fried fish. When he was satisfied he could haggle them no lower. He paid, and the two of them sat up against a seawall and watched the mass of humanity pass by. Sade studied men and women of all ages as they went about their business. Against the wall, out of the stream of people, they were ignored. They might as well have been invisible. It was anonymity Sade liked, but it did not suit Vondales. "Let's go back to the boat and eat," his brother said. Sade understood why his brother yearned for the familiar. The flip side of anonymity was a heavy sense of loneliness. This place felt foreign. Sade was tempted to indulge his brother when a boy about Vondales' age, maybe younger, with red hair and a spray of freckles across his face, walked up to them and offered to sell them grilled corn on the cob. Sade was still hungry, and he saw the way his brother leaned forward and pursed his lips at the prospect. "How much?" 20 pence, the boy said in a high, friendly voice that came out like a chirp. "That's robbery," Sade said. "I'd give you 2. "We could agree on 12. 5. 10. "Give it here, then," Sade said, offering the coins. The boy laughed. "I took you 2 for just off the boat. You were more canny than I thought, though." "We have just arrived," Vondales said. Sade immediately shot him a look of ire. "But we've been here to Greatport before," Sade said. "Have you now? Then you would know this ain't Greatport but Morniport." Sade felt his face flush. The boy politely spoke up to cover his embarrassment. "No harm done. Your accents and clothes mark you as just arriving here." "Do they?" Sade said with more malice in his voice than he intended. He was self-conscious, and this boy made him feel small and backwards. Of course, they had just seen their first big port, and by virtue of it simply being larger than Linnisport, they had taken it for the capital. "What hayheads we are!" The boy offered them a 3rd ear of corn. "Here, this one is free. Welcome to Morniport and the Isle of Prawn." Now at least they knew where they were. Sade was hesitant to accept gifts from a stranger, but the boy was cordial enough and he was still hungry himself. He also did not want to offend a potential ally. "I'd rather have information." "Take it. Your friend here looks as if he needs it. Information is free. Morniport is a friendly one." Vondales looked at him with hungry eyes, and he nodded. Vondales took the ear of corn, broke it in half, and held out the larger half to Sade. Sade took the smaller one. He never would have admitted it, but he relished giving his brother small treats. By the way Vondales bit into the corn, Sade knew his brother was grateful for his generosity. "I'm Timos," the boy said, extending his hand. Sade shook it and introduced themselves as Patrick and Gary. Timos was unsuspecting. He had more ears left, and he shook out his basket, a few stray kernels falling to the muddy ground. "Where can we sell something, Timos?" "What is it you want to sell?" Timos's eyes dipped down toward Sade's satchel. "Books," Sade said carefully. "Spell books, we think, for weatherworking." "Oh, you can sell those at the market. I'll show you the way. I'm headed through there anyway." Timos started down the seawall without looking back to see if they followed. Vondales gave Sade a questioning look. "He seems harmless enough," Sade said. "Can't hurt to follow him, learn the port a bit better." They caught up with Timos as he was about to disappear into the crowd. They wove between fishmongers selling their catch, women shucking oysters, and girls carrying water on their heads. The sight of the girls reminded Sade of the girl he had run down in Linnisport, but he dug his nails into the meat of his hands and suppressed the feelings that troubled him. Instead, he focused on the bustle of the port and the characters around them. Timos passed through the crowd with barely a glance, but Sade was taken with a variety of people, young, old, rich, poor, strong, and weak. His attention fell on a trio of armed men, escorting a harbor master who was collecting fees from the bigger ships. They were fell-looking warriors, armed with maces and axes, but they were nothing compared to the dozen spearmen that crossed the market square, protecting a litter carried by 6 slaves. "Who's in there?" Sade asked. "Not who, but what," Timos said. "It's a spice shipment, more precious than gold." The streets were dirty with horse droppings and fish offal. These mixed with the smell of sweat, cooking oil, and tobacco into a heady aroma that made Sade's eyes water. He missed the fresh air of the sea. Timos turned down an alleyway, hopping over the gutter in the center. He stopped by a shuttered window and knocked. "'Tis the house of ladies," he said. "They will show you their tits for 5 pence." Vondales was pressing up against him just as the shutters opened. A young girl, just a few years older than them, in a loose-fitting saffron dress, waited on the other side. Sade couldn't help his eyes from falling on the cleavage between her ample breasts. "Timos, how was the day? You have friends?" she said. "Patrick and Gary, meet Jermaine." He reached in his pocket and placed a 5-pence coin on the sill. "We were hoping for a show." To Sade's wonderment, the girl did not take offense and instead unbuttoned her top to let her breasts with their flowery pink nipples spill out. Vondales pushed him off balance as he craned for a better look. She turned her shoulders to point one, then the other, in their direction. With their hands, she massaged and squeezed them in a way Sade thought impossible. Timos glanced sideways. "Want to see more?" "Yes," Sade heard himself say. Timos escorted them down the alleyway through a door that led to a dark hallway. The smell of perfume touched Sade's nose and was as beautiful and desirable as the smells of the city outside were detestable. They came into a long room where girls reclined on couches, and Jermaine was turning back from the window and pulling the shutters closed. "What have you brought us, Timos?" said a woman who, by her features, could have been Jermaine's sister. "These are Patrick and Gary, 2 friends I made at the port today. We were on our way to the book market." The older woman, her chest breathtaking, loosed a lace on her bodice and twirled it about her finger. "Oh, are you in a rush or do you have time to play?" Sade could not believe their good fortune. He answered that they did. The girls seated them on the couches. Jermaine, her sister, and an olive-skinned girl with long flowing black hair surrounded them bare-chested. Sade did not know where to look. He saw such paradise in all directions, such perfection. He felt warm and shook as if he might explode, faint, or both. A 4th girl, a younger one with auburn hair, came over, unlaced her top, and handed Sade and his brother goblets of grog. "Men on men's business need a man's drink," she said. "Of course," Sade said, gulping down the mix of rum and water. It bathed his chest in a warm glow. His limbs no longer felt like they would tremble off. His brother had bravely reached out to squeeze Jermaine's breast. She giggled and sighed. Sade took a second drink, then lifted his head closer. Closer. He wanted to touch one with his mouth. He no longer was self-conscious, but the room was spinning violently. The objects of his desire seemed to recede just out of his reach, and darkness closed in on the sides. When they woke on the beach under a pier, all their possessions, satchel, books, hatchet, change purse, were gone. Even their shoes and the buttons on their jackets had been stolen. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Chapter 12. Dancer. The Kajilin were not difficult to track. Their path led out of the forest and into the moorlands. Gabriella ran between thickets of heather, keeping as low to the ground as she could, while running to catch up with the riders. Her clothes were soon streaked with red from slipping through the bushes. She was surprised how easily the pigment rubbed off from the leaves. When she crushed one between her fingers, her hand was quickly covered in scarlet sap, as if she had cut herself deeply. From what she knew of the Red Riders, they had no mercy for their captives, and they sought to make examples of those trespassers they captured. Her imagination conjured horrible endings for her friends. She was certain they would execute Omanuju, perhaps feast on Adamantus, and leave the bones of both of them to rot on the seashore as warnings to other landing parties. She was far from the Elan now, and Gabriella wondered if she could even find her way back in the dark. Why was she even following? She wondered. She had no plan, no help, no weapons that could aid her, and yet she knew she could not leave her friends to face their fate alone, even if all she was to do was witness their ends. No, there had to be something she could do. Think, Gabriella. Gabriella was weary and shaking with worry by the time the Kajillian reached the rocky shore of Shingle. She crept through the heather, bolder now, with the sound of the breaking waves and gusting wind to cover the noise of her pursuit. The shore of Kajil was similar to Harkness. Gnarled Caledonian trees grew sparsely along the shore of both islands, and the riders made camp under a copse of the trees. When the riders loosened Adamantus's bindings, the elk struck at the nearest man with his antlers, sending the man tumbling. He gashed another man in the face with a hoof. The Kajillians rallied, wrapping his neck and the base of his antlers in thick ropes, then fastening the ends of the trunks to the nearest trees. Adamantus was left standing, but stuck, unable to run or move his massive antlers. This was a spot where the riders had camped and killed before, with the fire ring already built around a large flat stone that Gabriella took to be an altar. The altar was high enough that there were steps that led to its top. It looked out over the breaking waves, its edges lined with skulls and an assortment of bones, its surface cut with deep channels for catching blood. The Kajilian led Omanuju up to the top of the rock and left him there, waiting, lying bound on his side, his face swollen, his gag blood-stained. They built a fire and sharpened their swords on wet stones, while Omanuju watched, his eyes wide and white with fear. There was clearly some ritual associated with the coming execution. The riders erected torches at the four corners of the altar and lit them so that their flames burned against the glowing sky. After each torch was positioned, the rider at its base would kneel down, press his forehead to the altar, and mumble some type of prayer, the words lost in the sounds of the sea and the blowing night wind. Many of the riders had their masks up as they worked, and Gabriella could see the Kajilian were a swarthy lot with olive skin, very different from the light-skinned people on her island. Gabriella recalled stories of the Kajilian and remembered that they were indeed a people of complex ritual who saw deep meaning in symbols and ceremony. A sailor from her home island had watched a harvest festival in the town through a spyglass from a ship. He saw maidens, their bodies covered in the red dye of the Moors, who danced all night around offering fires. The Kajilian men and women chanted in unison. Gabriella wondered if the Kajilian worshipped their ancestors, or did they pray to the same gods the Harkonites worshipped, or were their precious dyes their gods? She looked down at the oily red substance on her legs and arms. It had a buttery smell and spread easily on her skin. If nothing else, the Kajilian held ritual dance in high regard like the people of her island. Gabriella crushed more leaves between her palms and felt the stirrings of a plan. The camp was ablaze with light from the torches and the roaring fire. The Kajilian had fashioned a spit over the fire for Adamantus. The elk was still tied between the trees, and although he strained against his bindings, the ropes were strong and had not given way. Omanuju remained where he had been left, and had been otherwise ignored, although the riders had attended to the offering space around him, laying down clay pots and bowls at the edge of the great flat rock in order to catch his blood. The blades had been sharpened and were waiting next to the bowls and pots, their edges catching the yellow shine from the fires. Gabriella crouched in the bushes, rubbing her skin with a red stain, her nose overwhelmed with the smell of the sap. She was worried that the sweat dripping from her brow would ruin the extemporaneous sky she had fashioned. She swallowed hard. Her plan had only two outcomes, and one meant death for all three of them. But what other choice did she have? As she stepped out of the bushes, she recalled that moment at the summoning just days before, when all her thoughts had rushed out of her, her own personality suppressed under something greater. The gods, or the dead, whatever it had been, would not have taken possession of her, would not have prophesied through her, if there was not a greater purpose to be fulfilled. A divine purpose, she reminded herself as she walked down the beach into the firelight. She had conducted an inventory of all that she had. It was not much, but she was not without resources. The gods had seen to that. As fair as she was, Gabriella could have stood out as a foreigner, but the oil of the heather was her disguise, and she hoped their salvation. Her body was uniformly red, casting her in the role of a harvest dancer. She had done more than simply paint herself. As unused to it as she was, she knew her body had the emerging curves of a woman. Her hips and her breast had grown in the past months. She felt like a child still, an imposter trying to fill the role of seductress. Her breasts too small, her hips too narrow. But she was a maiden, and perhaps that would be enough. She had disrobed as much as she had dared. She had removed her shirt and tied it in a band around her breast that left her shoulders and midriff bare. She had rolled her undergarments up to her waist, exposing her hips and buttocks. She felt like a fool, but from what she knew of men, even at her young age of 14, she knew it did not take much to distract them. With the pigment covering her body in the growing darkness, she prayed she would prove enticing enough. Gabriella had one last asset dangling between her breasts, the whistle. It was likely least among her resources, but she was determined to use everything at her disposal. Its piercing sound was an otherworldly tone that would serve her now as the chord to strike upon her entrance. It was time. The tide was out and the breakers were crashing far out to sea, revealing a shore covered in pools and puddles rifled by wind. It was an empty wasteland with no place to hide. The wind gusts fanned the flames of the fires, carrying the Kajilans' voice and their strange tongue on the air. They waited in a halo of light, outside of which was thick darkness barely diluted by the silver of moon. A moon that was waxing. Time was slipping past for Omanuju, for Adamantis, and for the journey's prophecy to come true. With one last prayer to the gods and her faith in forces beyond herself, Gabriella stepped into the half-light, lifted the whistle to her lips, and blew. The sound was as she remembered it, piercing, overriding, and pure. It startled the horses who twisted at their restraints, some of them pulling free and galloping down the beach. 3 Kajilan ran after in pursuit, but the rest stood stock still, arrested by the sight of her. Gabriella paused in their midst, a vermilion phantom having materialized out of the darkness. Her body, her clothes, even her hair was stained the color of roses, of wine, even blood. Whether they took her for one of their own or an apparition, it mattered not. Gabriella knew the spell would only last so long. To prolong it, she had to perform. Gabriella leapt forward to the fire, dipped her head down, and whipped her hair upwards in a fury. She channeled the motion of all the dancers she had ever seen throughout her life at carnivals, festivals, and summonings. It was her wildest hope that perhaps one of the gods would take possession of her again, guiding her steps and inspiring her movements. But feeling very much herself, she was forced to press onward with a dance of her own invention. She was by turns sensual, then coy, aggressive, then retreating, a crimson temptress. Whether it was simply the surprise of her appearance or her glistening body, Gabriella held the Kajilan captive. Some of them even clapped as she twirled herself around close to the fire. She could not understand the words they were shouting, but their intent was clear enough. Their own hoots and whoops of approval ringing out with each provocative move she made, every suggestive gesture she performed. She felt a rush throughout her body that was in part horror of self-consciousness and in part the frisson of freedom, as if breaking off shackles that had held her for a lifetime. She was nearly naked, her flesh exposed, yet for a bit longer she felt protected by something sacrosanct, the protocol of ceremony, the spellbinding power of lust. Perhaps the gods were looking out for her after all. But her time was running short. Gabriella had to press what advantage she had while she still held it. She moved close to one Kajilan who was seated on a rock and made a theatric reaching motion towards his waist. The other men laughed while he shifted his feet. She made the motion again, her fingers drawing closer to his belt and pointing downward. He wiped his brow and licked his lips as she went down on one knee and slowly reached for the pommel of his sword. Now the men laughed even louder. The seated Kajilan's face flushed with embarrassment at his own salacious thoughts. Relieved and somewhat abashed, he drew his sword and held out the handle to her, a prop for her dance. Gabriella did not take the weapon immediately. Instead, she made exaggerated expressions of awe fawning over it, moving her hands along the length of it, not unlike the way she had seen sword sellers do when hawking their wares. She touched her fingers to the blade and pantomimed injuring her hand. This produced hearty guffaws in her audience. Now she knew she had them. She spun away from the seated Kajilan, only to swing herself back and grab the sword. He released it smiling, pleased with himself, his benevolence, and the role he was playing in the show. The sword was heavy in Gabriella's arms, and she had to rein in her movements and shorten her swings so that she did not trip or fall as she danced with the added weight. But the spirit of the moment was still strong in her, and soon Gabriella moved with the sword as if it were an extension of her own body. She fought invisible foes using forceful strikes and grandiose parries. She even made a show of challenging some of the men, leaping towards them, shaking the blade and crying out with a sharp yelp. Some of the Kajilan flinched, startled, but the others made a brave display of not moving. even when she came close, hissing and barking like an animal. She was not sure what had taken over her, but she no longer felt like herself. She wondered if this was what it was like to be drunk, to be in the same body, but to feel so free, different, and brave. But time. She was constantly aware of time, even as she beat it out in her measured steps. She knew the third act had come. Gabriella had been phantom, then temptress. Now it was time to be huntress. She turned toward Adamantus, raising her arms in surprise and rocking back on her heels to feign fear. She stalked the elk as a huntress might stalk her prey, holding the sword at the ready, the firelight glinting on the sharpened edge. Even Adamantus was taken with her performance, as he pulled at his bindings and rolled his eyes in fear. The elk fought his restraints, the lines taut and twisting. Gabriella danced closer, wielding the sword, moving about the elk's body, the point hovering over his neck as if she would be the one to sacrifice the beast. The Khajilan were silent now, unsure of what was about to unfold. Time was fluid in that last moment, bending and stretching so that the span of a heartbeat felt to last an eternity in which Gabriella was acutely aware of her surroundings, her body, and the encroaching danger and the spell about to be broken. She heard a wave break out in the darkness, the torches snarling in the wind, and the rocky shingle shifting under her feet. She was aware of her own flagging strength, the exhilaration that had steeled her against the cold, the rocky ground. The heavy sword was fading, draining from her. Her toes were numb, and the soles of her feet painful. Her palms were slick with sweat, making the sword handle feel as if it was covered in cooking oil. Goose flesh formed on her skin, and the red she had painted on herself felt as if it were smearing, fading with each sweep of her arms. She was no longer brave. She felt scared, sick, exposed, foolish as she swung the blade downward with a sudden cry. The spell protecting her all but ended. But the blade struck true and sliced through the line holding Adamantus, and a new protector loomed over her. His head now free, Adamantus easily snapped the second line with his antlers and reared up on his hind legs. The Khajilan, dumbstruck at the trickery that had befallen them, stared, their eyes lidless. Gabriella did not wait. She charged across the shingle and up onto the sacrificial stone where she cut Omanuju's bindings with the sword. She could see the marks from the abuse by his captors, the pool of blood beneath his head, but he moved quickly to free himself of the ropes and clambered to his feet. Adamantus wasted no time charging the Khajilan, swinging his antlers, lifting men up into the air and flinging them end over end. Their adversaries called to each other, waving back those that had fled after the startled horses. Adamantus charged again, and after scattering the men, he turned and galloped to Gabriella and Omanuju. There was no hope in fighting, only escape. Omanuju leapt upon Adamantus's back and pulled Gabriella up before him. The elk splashed briefly through the surf before turning and galloping across the moorland towards the forest and the Elan. The only illumination came from the thin as a blade moon, but it was enough for the elk who carried them over rises and ridge lines without giving ground to the Khajilan now in pursuit. Their horses were not nearly as sure-footed in the dark. Gabriella heard a few whinny and tumble, tossing their riders who rolled into the heather with grunts and gasps. By the time Adamantus reached the forest, they had a lead. They needed it, for the path through the woods proved harder to find, slowing the elk. The Khajilan now had the advantage, for they knew the forest trails well. Soon, they could be heard crashing through the underbrush. Adamantus was panicking, rearing and hissing through his nostrils while the riders gained ground. The elk dashed down the trail, only to find their path blocked by a sheer cliff. Gabriella knew they had to be close to the Elan. Even in the dark, she could make out the ridge where they had found the waterfall. "Easy, old friend." Omanuju patted Adamantus's neck. The elk settled and turned downhill, and then found a path out of the woods and into a meadow cast white in the moonlight. Adamantus heaved himself up the incline like a goat, Gabriella nearly falling if not for Omanuju's firm grip. She could feel the elk's heart beating between her legs. Flecks of foam spun out of his mouth. An arrow whistled past their heads and embedded itself in a tree with a thunk. The woods were alive, with the sound of creatures fleeing just ahead of them, and birds disturbed from their sleep flapping into the air above them. They came to the clearing with the traps. This time, the elk skirted them by inches. Curtains of moss hanging from the trees passed over them, and branches slapped painfully at their faces. But after hurtling through a few more bushes and over logs, they burst into the clearing with the waterfall where the Elan waited. Flames flickered in the lanterns that hung on the fore and aft post. As they splashed through the stream and galloped beside the pool, a familiar figure appeared at the railing. "Well, about time you—" Gade's words were cut off as an arrow flew out of the darkness and lodged into the port rail. He yanked it out, one hand curled into a fist, the other brushing the damaged railing. "Gade, ready the ship to fly," Omanuju cried. But Gade had already fled from the rail and was swinging across the deck on the same line that opened the paneled sails. They bloomed in the moonlight, and Gabriella thought she had never seen such a welcome sight. As the elk slowed at the bottom of the gangway, she slid off his back to run and untie the mooring line. The riders had closed the distance, their white masks flying up the hill like vengeful spirits. They fired barrages of arrows at their fleeing captives. Gabriella cursed, realizing her miscalculation. She could not reach the gangway without exposing herself to the deadly arrows. The Elan was already rising. Omanuju waited at the top of the gangway for her. She waved him away. "Pull it up. Climb out of their range." She ran back along the length of the ship, towards the bow, away from the arrows, and clutched the line she had just loosened. With hands and feet she held on as the Elan caught the wind and climbed. The ground swept out from under her, and she crushed through the branches of the nearest trees. If she had thought the ride through the forest had been punishing, this was far worse. More than once she lost her grip and slid down the line, her palms burning and her legs twisting around the rope to catch herself. Then she was clear of the canopy. Arrows flew past, and she was left to count on luck to keep her unscathed. It held. The Elan moved out of the bow shot, and the ridge dropped away beneath Gabriella. She dared not look down as she swung over a ravine where the rushing river below was but a thread in the moonlight. The exertion from her pursuit of the Kajilan, dancing with the heavy sword, holding on to Adamantus as he fled, all caught up with her now. Her arms shook with fatigue and her legs felt like jelly. She slid downward, watching the Elan recede, knowing the end of the rope was not far. "Gade!" she cried. Like the miracle she needed, the sailor came swooping down from the darkness, riding a rope as if it were a finger of the gods. They collided in midair, and Gabriella felt herself wrenched away from the mooring line. They floated skywards on the upswing, the line wrapping about the Elan's hull and pulling them closer, up and over the port rail. They landed on the deck, Gade's feet planted firmly on the boards. He held Gabriella securely in his arms and took a few steps forward to slow his own momentum. In the lantern light, he looked her up and down, noting her streaked crimson skin and hair, the welts from the tree branches, her blistered palms, her altered clothes. "Demon's feet," he said, shaking his head. "You look better in blue." Chapter 13. The Guild. Sade and Vondales were destitute again. Even the skiff they had stolen had been taken away. It was late afternoon and the dinner hour was upon them, an expanse of time yawning open and empty as their stomachs. Food, in the form of fish, was plentiful, piled in market stalls all around them, roasting over coals, dripping in oil, and tantalizingly out of reach. With no money and nothing to trade with, they were helpless. Sade thought of pilfering a loaf of bread or a wheel of cheese from a booth, but already he had a look of desperation, and shopkeepers turned a close eye on him whenever he neared. As night fell, they found themselves beneath a pier, their stomachs painful as they searched for a place to sleep. The rocky shore was littered with empty mussel shells, fish bones, and lime peels. Crabs picked at the rotting carcass of a seal. They found a gap in the seawall where they huddled together, but the cold was unrelenting as the stone beneath them was hard. Vondales slept, for most of his weight was on Sade, but Sade, with the rock pressing beneath him and his limbs shaking from the chill, remained awake. Therefore, he heard the footsteps of boys approaching before he could see them. He hoped they would just pass by, even not notice them, but they instead made straight for the gap where he and his brother were hiding. There were 5 of them, their voices distinct with the nasal accent of the island. Their clothes were worn, the colors obscured by grime and the darkness. They gathered around Sade while Vondales slept. Sade would have moved, but his legs had gone numb from his brother's weight. A tall boy with greasy bangs stepped forward and spoke. "You need to come with us." Sade didn't move. He was not sure, with the pins and needles prickling his flesh, if he would even be able to stand up. He shook Vondales awake. His brother startled when he saw the other boys. It suddenly felt very crowded beneath the pier. "Get up, Vondales," Sade said. His brother complied and addressed the boy who had spoken. "Who are you?" "I'm Finn. We're from the guild, and I'll say it once more. You need to come with us." Sade didn't know what the guild was, but he had no reason to trust these boys. They had already been taken advantage of by Timos. "What if we don't want to?" Sade said, rubbing his legs, hoping that he would be able to spring up and run if needed. "It's not an invitation," a rotund boy said from the flank. He clicked the dagger on his belt in and out of his sheath. Sade flexed his thighs and straightened his knees. He might be able to get up, but not fight. Not yet, at least. His head was spinning from hunger or the potion Timos and his lady friends had given them. Sade studied the 5 boys, trying to take each one's measure. As if reading his mind, Finn spoke. "If we wanted you dead, you'd already be dead." "We don't have anything," Sade said, pulling his pockets inside out, hopeful that he could simply deflect their attention. "We know. You wouldn't be down here if you did." Finn's expression softened. "We can offer you a dry place, out of the damp, even something to eat, but you have to come now." Vondales looked at him expectant. The decision was Sade's. He looked at the rotund boy's dagger, the warm clothes on all of their backs, and their faces, which were not drawn or narrow from hunger. Sensation returning to his legs, he said, "All right, we'll come." The boys led them through parts of the city they never would have ventured to on their own, through alleyways, under bridges, even through sewers. Just when Sade thought they were coming to a dead end, Finn would disappear down a broken grate, slip through a gap in the wall, or duck under a fence, and they would continue. Finding their way back along the path they had come was soon impossible. Sade instead tried to track landmarks, the position of the hills outside the city, the whereabouts of the moon, the placement of a silo. But even those landmarks proved useless when they ventured underground through a series of tunnels that carried water from the hills to flush away the refuse and waste of the city. In places, the stench of backed-up excrement was overwhelming, but in other tunnels, the water ran clear and swift. They made their way along the footpath that only allowed for them to walk single file. "When the rains came each year, the city used to flood until they built these tunnels," Finn explained. "The first series were not big enough, so they built underground reservoirs. One of them is blocked, and the guild uses it as a shelter. The sheriff's men leave us be, as long as we keep the blockages out of the other tunnels. It's a sort of truce we have with them." "What is the guild?" Sade asked. "You'll see," the rotund boy said. Finn felt no need to be so mysterious. "It's a band of us who live beneath the streets. Most of us runaways, orphans, and the like. If you want to thieve or beg on the streets, and if you are a runaway or orphan, you have to work with us. And if we don't, then you are our enemy. Enemies find it hard to do business." But Finn smiled. "Life is tough on the streets. Why be enemies when together we can survive?" They could hear the other children before they could see them. The chatter of voices, laughter, the occasional shout and cry drifted down along the tunnels. Sade was sure they would happen upon a crowd of them as they rounded each other. But the tunnels were deceptive and sound carried far. It was not until they made 3 more turns that a tunnel opened up into a large reservoir. Its sides were lined with bricks and air came from the grates that lined the ceiling of the wall to their left. Water gushed through the far wall. It had been mostly blocked with stones, sticks, and logs, so that the flow of water, which normally would have filled the reservoir, was reduced to a stream that bisected the room. In the dry spaces, the children had set up broken tables mended with driftwood, mismatched chairs, and sleeping mats made of dirty rags. It was a city of the discarded. Tattered curtains and moth-eaten tapestries from dead houses hung from the ceiling, providing privacy to a corner of the hall, where girls kept to themselves, studiously avoiding eye contact with the boys. They were youth of all ages, children who shouted and played, kicking a ball made of old sacks tied together with twine, the older boys who smoked pipes and even spoke to some of the more mature girls that mingled among them. Sade avoided looking at them, wary of what had happened the last time they had trusted young women. Finn led them to a circle of boys seated on the floor. There were boys drinking grog and picking at the bones of a chicken as they played dice. Younger girls, supervised by an older one who played dice with the boys, were picking up the empty plates and refilling mugs. The place felt like a cross between a tavern and an orphanage. One young man looked up from the game of dice and watched as they approached. His face was narrow. Around his neck dangled a number of necklaces made of shells, bones, and glass beads. Twine bracelets encircled his wrists. Without anyone telling him, Sade knew that this room belonged to him. This young man was seated in the center of the action, and yet was apart from it. His wide hazel eyes scanning back and forth from the game before him to the far dark corners. The other boys looked to him as they joked and jibed, as if waiting to take measure of his reaction. Even the servant girls refilled his mug first. As Finn brought them closer, his leader of the underworld stood up, unfolding long legs. He was nearly a man, with the first shadows of a beard darkening his jaw and chin in a comely way. He offered no smile or greeting as his eyes darted up and down Sade and Vondales. His expression did not betray what he might have thought. Underground royalty. Finn introduced him as Nicholas, and he was indeed the boy king of the underworld, leader of the guild, and, Sade knew, their only chance at survival. Sade dropped to his knees and pledged his allegiance to the guild immediately. Vondales followed. So began their time of thieving and begging, all of which was organized by the older boys and a few indomitable girls. Begging was hard, but thieving easy. Interestingly, there were two main methods used for thievery: out-and-out robbery, for which brawn and intimidation were required, or trickery, which took cunning. Vondales took to robbery well. Solid, compact, and fast, he could beat most of the other boys in fisticuffs and wrestling. An unsuspecting citizen stood no chance against him. Sade, on the other hand, excelled at the art of the scheme, which took more preparation but often yielded a greater reward. Sade and his brother were quick studies. They learned how to pick locks, pockets, and, importantly, how to profess innocence if caught. Sade could talk himself out of predicaments other boys could not, mainly as a result of his accent and the way his mother had raised them, making sure they spoke properly and correctly. When cornered and accused, Sade would convince adults that he lived a respectable life with a comfortable merchant family, except those times when they were caught red-handed, which often simply required flight and stamina to outrun their pursuers. Sade found the opportunities in the underside of the world were great. Men cheating on their wives with mistresses were good marks. Sade would steal into the windows of whorehouses and swipe a change purse right from a man's trousers hanging on a bedpost. In the dark, huffing, puffing, and sighing over one another, the adults would be none the wiser. Drunkards passed out on the street and groaning in the gutter made easy targets for pickpocketing. Men who gambled in the taverns could be distracted by girls, as he and his brother had been, when they were winning, and comforted by them when they were losing, all for a price. Sade, with his quick mind and knack for numbers, proved more effective at negotiating these transactions than other boys. Begging, which the younger boys and girls were made to do, was harder than thievery. Sade was too old anyway and lacked the required cuteness. If anything, over time his facial features had become hardened. His cheekbones were more pronounced, his lips thin and fine. These were the features of his mother, and they had made her exotic-looking in her own time. But in the underworld they earned Sade the moniker of the Snake. With such a face, he was largely useless for begging. He was simply too intimidating, but he recognized the potential inherent in panhandling. He knew an opportunity when he saw it. The children put little thought into where they positioned themselves, except that they all crowded at busy corners, essentially competing with each other. Sade took it upon himself to learn the city, and with Nicholas's permission, spread the children out, concentrating them in richer neighborhoods. He tracked their earnings. The ones who did well he rewarded with food, but not so much that they ever grew fat and lost their stricken, starving, pathetic look. When a child's earnings dropped, Sade would move him or her to a new corner, unless they had become too old to beg, in which case the boys were taught how to steal, and the girls how to please men. The children with the most pleasant faces earned more, but not more than the lame ones. Lamed, scarred, beaten, and bruised children brought in the most coin. So much so that Sade had Vondales' blackened eyes, scratched faces, and split lips. Children would be compensated for the pain from their own increased earnings. So, they cooperated for the most part. Any who didn't found they were beaten more severely. Vondales grew to enjoy inflicting violence on his victims. It fed his confidence, which had been shattered since their own abandonment and maltreatment. To punish another was to be reassured of one's own power. So, it was with casual air that Sade suggested one day to Nicholas that they burn a boy. With permanent disfigurement, Sade calculated the boy would earn more. Nicholas, he had learned, was loyal to his subjects but not beyond cruelty. It did not take long to convert him, but it was impossible to find volunteers. Instead, they waited to find a runaway fresh off a boat, as Sade and Vondales had been. They pulled a similar trick on him to what Timos had played on them, except this time, the boy, Simon, was from the island of Cardiff. He was lured in by the promise of food, drugged, then his face disfigured with a hot iron. Nursing him back to health took some time, and of course at first he was reluctant to cooperate with those that had disfigured him. But alone, scared, and starving, he eventually acquiesced. Sade stationed him outside the Temple of Prayers, and Simon soon became the most productive boy in his stable. So productive that Sade improved upon the plan, cutting out the eyes of the next runaway boy they found. Blinded, he could not recognize that his rescuers were the same as those who had maimed him, and thus was much more cooperative. Practically cruelty, Sade called it, but it came with a price. Just as he had felt overwhelmed and vomited after killing his uncle, just as he has felt a strange sense of emptiness after running down the girl in Lennisport, each time they blinded a boy, sent the girl out with a man for the first time, Sade felt a sickness in the pit of his stomach. Some nights he had nightmares where they were on Skull Point again, cutting out the eyes of their own mother. He would awake in a cold, trembling sweat, but he swallowed the guilt and spoke of it to no one. Eventually it lessened. He willed it to, because he knew he had to survive. Survival is everything. Those with power survive. It was not long before there was an epidemic of blindness among the youngest of boys and some girls on the streets. Sade would organize them around the temple. He was not familiar with the island's religion, but he knew it paid. Or at least its worshippers did. Their only adversaries in the enterprise were the sheriff's men, and above them, the king's men. Armed like soldiers and clad with blue cloaks, they were the highest enforcers of the law on the island and followed a chain of command directly to the king himself. Unlike sheriff's men, the king's men were not easily bribed. After all, it was the sheriff's men who tolerated the guild living in the sewers, so long as they cleared the occasional blockage and made sure that the bodies dumped there did not resurface. The king's men were different. Their prisoners never ended up missing or dead. Each received a trial and no bribe could free them. When they captured a boy for stealing, he was sent to an orphanage or, if his crime grievous enough, forced to work in a mine. They were thorough where the sheriff's men were lackadaisical, persistent where their lower counterparts were lazy. Something as petty as pickpocketing did not always attract their attention or resources, but maiming other children, and certainly murder, would. Sade and Vondales did what they could to avoid them. Any child in the guild knew that if they ever threatened to go to the king's men, they too would end up disappearing. Time passed. Seasons changed. Sade and Vondales' influence grew. Boys came to them for help, advice, even permission for new schemes. Soon, Sade and his brother took customary seats next to Nicholas. Vondales, quick, strong, menacing, on the boy king's left, a bodyguard of sorts, and Sade on his right, a counselor and captain. They had their share of grog, meat, and girls. They might not have been kings, but they were indeed princes. And so they were seated on Nicholas' left and right, a game of cards going on among them one evening, when some of the older boys dragged in Timos. Timos was taller, his hair longer, his boyishness being replaced by features that were more manly, a stronger chin, a feathering of whiskers above his lips and on his chin, and a more pronounced notch in his throat. His clothes were well made, not like a noble's, but close. Obviously, he lived a comfortable life and still did well for himself. Two larger and older boys, Carter and Andre, held him by either arm. He had not come willingly. His face was swollen, his shirt untucked, his collar turned upward, and the knees of his trousers ripped. Nicholas dropped his cards to the floor, pushed himself up, and clapped his hands on Timos' shoulder. Timos, still not paying your dues to the guild. I paid them already. 8 months ago, Nicholas said. The guild requires monthly fees to operate in our territory. I don't work in your territory. Everybody works in our territory. Maybe you didn't know, but we've grown. Timos looked at his feet, his hair falling across his face. In a small voice, he asked, How much do you want? Before Timos could speak, Sade stood. Sir, a word. Nicholas turned from Timos, who did not even recognize Sade or his brother. Sade realized his heart was beating in his chest. Uncharacteristically, he stammered as he began to speak. This is the boy who deceived my brother and me when we first arrived. Nicholas turned his head, intrigued. Timos, do you recognize these young men, these friends of mine? Timos shook his head to see around the hair that had fallen across his face, looked at Sade and said, No, I don't recall him. How about the face of my brother? Sade asked, gesturing to Vondales, who sat coiled like a cat, ready to pounce. Or maybe you would recall what you took from us, our money, our clothes, our books? Timos closed his eyes and sighed. Yes, I remember now. The books. Useless. We could barely give them away. Do you still have them? Sade stepped forward. His hands were shaking now, but he did not bother hiding it. The prospect of the power the books represented made his entire body feel light and charged. Timos nodded with vigor, sensing an opportunity to bargain. I sold one for its cover and used the pages of another for fire starting, but there is one I still have. Sade clenched his fist. At least there is still one. Sir, he said to Nicholas, I ask that we consider the property he stole from us when we assess his debts. Granted. Nicholas faced Timos, bending down to rub the patch of red fuzz on his chin. Oh, Timos, how the tables have turned. I'll return the book, as well as double the money you stole to make up for the ones you destroyed or sold. This in addition to the fees you owe the guild. Timos's lips whitened as he pressed them together in a frown, but Sade knew it was for show. He was still getting off lightly. I'll do it, he said, and I'll arrange to pay future fees. Nicholas brushed the hair out of Timos's face. That goes without saying. Of course, Timos swallowed. You have been very gracious. Does that mean I can go? A few of the boys in the circle of card players laughed. Nicholas looked at them askance and smiled. Timos, your debts are not yet paid. There are your penalties. You don't think I can let you go so easily? Not with so many of my own watching. What precedent would I be setting? Timos looked around, as if becoming aware of the 5 children who had stopped whatever they were doing and were watching the drama unfold before them. A precedent of graciousness, sir? Timos croaked. Nicholas narrowed his eyes and said between clenched teeth, I am not gracious. Andre, Carter, show him how gracious we are in the guild. The 2 boys on either side of Timos released him, and each made to strike. But living on the street by his wits and his own fist had made Timos quick and cunning. His previous show of weakness had been exaggerated, for he ducked one punch while reaching for Andre's belt and snatched his knife by the handle. He spun and caught Carter just before he lunged forward, slicing a rip in his sleeve and gash in his arm. Timos's feet were still in a fighting stance. The knife held out purposefully, not so far that he could not defend himself, not so close that he could not strike. Sade sensed those around him stiffening, reaching for their own blades and clubs, but they were slow, reluctant. It was clear Timos had training, the extent of which no one knew, and no one, not even Nicholas, was willing to engage him in one-to-one combat to find out. Except for Vondales. He stood up slowly, without a weapon, and stepped towards Timos. Vondales' eyes were unblinking, unmoving, even as he neared his adversary. He'd copied Timos' stance, extending a hand that was empty into the space between them. For an eternity, no one in the entire hall moved, spoke, or breathed. Then Vondales feinted an attack, and Timos swung the knife at his torso. Vondales caught Timos's wrist with a slap and clenched it in a vice-like grip. Timos' eyes widened with surprise, only to widen further when Vondales released him without taking the dagger. Sade's brother reset himself into a fighting stance, lifting his hands once more into the neutral zone between them. Except this time, he curled a single finger towards himself. Timos was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling. His eyes darted for the nearest tunnel opening, his feet shifted. Vondales met his eyes and curled his finger again. This time, Timos struck, jabbing into Vondales' chest. Again, Vondales caught him by the wrist only to release him, leaving the knife in Timos' possession. Timos whipped his blade a third time, slashing at the same hand Vondales had been catching him with, expecting it to come down again. But Vondales swept in the opposite arm and caught Timos once more. This time, the tendons in Vondales' wrist stood out, the pulse in his neck began to visibly beat, and his face turned red with exertion. While he squeezed Timos' forearm, Timos let out a small cry and dropped the knife. Vondales kicked it away, then turned Timos' arm against himself and made him punch his own face. The crowd laughed, but there was not a trace of mirth in Vondales. He took advantage of Timos while he was dazed, ripped his breeches down to his ankles, and then kicked him with such force between the legs that the gathered children gasped. Timos struggled for air and cried out. He fell to the floor only to have Vondales pick him up by the collar and strike him in the face with his knee. After 3 more such blows, a tooth dropped to the floor. When Vondales released him, Timos staggered, tripping on his breeches, and fell. He tried to crawl to safety, but Vondales dragged him by the ankle, drew him close, and began to kick him in his gut. Timos rolled, coughing and crying, his face dark and twisted in pain, his eyes squeezed to narrow slits, blood spraying out of his mouth with each strike. Vondales righted himself and sent another kick into the base of Timos' spine. His body arched backwards, and he wet himself. Hurt, humiliated, and defeated, Timos simply lay still, awaiting the next strike. Vondales provided it, stepping up to Timos' head, which he slammed against the stone floor with a stomp. He didn't stop. The chamber echoed with the thudding sound of Timos' skull on rock and his ragged breath. "Sade," Nicholas said, his face pale. "He's scared," Sade realized. Nicholas is scared. So was he of his own brother. Even though he could draw a straight line from the bewildered boy who had wept at Skull Point to the person before him, something had disappeared from his brother. Gone was the frightened boy who could not bring harm to his own sibling. He had been replaced by this young man who derived his worth, his power, from the harm he brought to others. Survival was everything. Those with power survive. Sade stood agog, bewildered at his own complicity in reshaping his brother. But without doubt, he knew that his brother's coldness, cruelty, and strength amounted to one thing: more power. So he waited a few more breaths, letting the echoes of Timos' head striking the stone travel throughout the chamber once more, just so all ears could hear, just so all could witness the ferocity in their midst. A ferocity I will have to contain. Sade stepped forward and called Vondales by name. His brother continued to hammer Timos with blows, unaware of his brother, unaware of the smallest children who were beginning to sob, unaware of AUNDREA, who said in a low voice, "He's had enough." Sade came closer. Vondales' knuckles were dark with blood. Timos' face was unrecognizable. The floor was awash with urine, blood, and spit. Vondales moved without tiring, raining his hatred and vengeance on Timos, releasing a storm of pain and loss that had been years in the making. He had no comprehension that the mood of the room had shifted, that Timos was now viewed as the victim, with sympathy even. Another tooth rolled out onto the floor. Sade reached out and touched his brother's shoulder. "Vondales, it's me, your brother." For an instant, he knew his own brother did not recognize him as his eyes darted up and down Sade's breadth and width, assessing him as an opponent. But the demon that had taken over Vondales released its grip and his spirit returned. "Sade," Vondales said, his eyes clearing. "You've punished him enough now," Sade said. Vondales turned back to examine Timos with the detachment of a hunter who had just butchered his kill. "He stole your books." "He did. We'll get them back." "You said we should never be weak again." "I did. You've proven how strong we are." Vondales nodded, and strangely, beneath the bloody, strapping body of a young man, Sade could sense the young, scared boy again, eager to please and desperate to survive in a harsh world that Sade had spelled out the rules for. His brother had listened. Vondales let go of Timos's collar, and he slumped to the floor. The room relaxed, the spectators drawing in a collective breath. One of the older boys cracked a joke, but no one laughed. Some of the older girls rushed over to see Timos. Slowly, voices returned to the room, and an ordinary clamor resumed. Sade took a basin from one of the girls tending to Timos and began to wash Vondales' hands and face. Young children were staring. Older ones watched them out of the corners of their eyes. No one came close. No one dared, except for Nicholas. The fear had left him, and he looked upon Vondales like a proud father to his son. "Vondales, I know just the place for you," he said. "You are going to the fighting pits. We will make a fortune." 14. Of bluefish and bird watching. The sun rose the next morning, slipping over the horizon like a freshly minted coin. Gade brought the elan low over the water and dropped a fishing line off the stern. By midday, he had reeled in 4 feisty bluefish. With a thin knife, he cleaned and gutted them, then sautéed them in a wide flat pan over the brazier with herbs and peppers. The result was delicious. "Our skipper has a charming touch for cooking as well." Gabriella used a biscuit to sop up the remaining sauce from her plate. "Not just cooking, but all the business of sailing," Omanuju said, helping himself to more. "Pilot and vessel are connected in ways we cannot see the eye alone. You notice the elan sails more smoothly under his hand than she ever did in mine." He was right, of course. Gabriella slept more soundly when Gade had piloted the elan than she ever had when Omanuju was at the helm. It seemed as if even the wind blew more favorably when Gade was at the wheel. Since Gade had kept the ship low to fish, Gabriella had nearly forgotten her terror of heights. With her eyes closed, she could imagine the elan was no more than a simple skiff floating in Harkness Harbor on a calm day. All the normal sounds of a ship's timbers and rigging creaking and sails flapping were familiar and reassuring. So much so that after their lunch of bluefish she began to doze, stretched out in the sun and soaking in its warmth. She woke when Omanuju settled down next to her, setting a bucket of water and a lump of large soap on the deck with a thump. "You showed great bravery on Kajil. If it weren't for you, Adamantis and I would be bones bleaching on the shore." She nodded, looking down at her skin still stained scarlet, a stark reminder of the danger they had been in and the desperate lengths she had gone to. "I'm glad it worked." "I am too, Miss Carlyle. I'm glad you chose to come along. It seems the dead judged wisely." He nudged the bucket. "I brought you some soap and water, in case you wanted to remove your costume." A good deal of her skin was still quite exposed. Her mother would have called her immodest, even indecent. But something had shifted inside her since her performance for the Kajilin. No longer did she feel tall and gangly. Instead, she felt lithe and graceful. She was proud of the outline of muscles on her midriff, the tautness of her arms and thighs. For the first time, she felt made of the same capable stuff as grown women, as if they were no longer members of separate universes, but rather one and the same. Then she laughed, picking up the bucket and soap. "I am taking myself much too seriously," she thought as she doused herself and began to scrub. Kajil dyes were valuable for a reason, though. They did not run easily. Even after an hour of bathing, her skin still had a ruddy glow to it. She decided she didn't mind. The remaining pigment was a reminder that her brush with womanhood had been real. The sky the next day was a deep blue, unbroken except by the smallest of clouds. The wind was up and swept the elan along too quickly to drag trawling lines. Omanuju spread maps out over the navigation table, while Adamantis slept next to the cabin's double doors, his long legs folded beneath him, his muzzle resting on the wooden deck. Gade was in good spirits, whistling and humming to himself. "We're making good time," he said. "To where exactly?" Gabriella asked. "This?" "Well, this is still a long way distant, and we need to make a stop or two before then. First off, we will need a map to help us through the labyrinth that surrounds Nicomedes's treasure." "Labyrinth? Won't that make it hard to find our way?" "That is why we will borrow a map from our friend Nicomedes. We'll just make a short stop at one of his workshops along the way." "He had workshops?" "Yes, but not just for anyone to find. They are hidden. But you have yourself a good skipper. I know the way." "All right," she said, realizing the faith they were placing in Gede, and that without him, they were worse than lost. In the late morning, they passed over a series of islands. From a distance, they were covered in black and white, but as the islands grew closer, Gabriella could see that they were actually textured with yellows and reds mixed in as well, their surfaces moving with thousands upon thousands of birds. "Puffins! There are thousands of them!" "More accurately, hundreds of thousands," Omanuju said. "We are in regions of the sea claimed by nature alone. More rocky islands that were home to hordes of pelicans passed beneath the Elan. Never had she seen such numbers of seabirds or such varieties. Gabriella even spotted storm petrels circling in the air. She knew them by their distinct, almost bat-like fluttering. They only came to Harkness in the spring, but in much smaller numbers. Here, they seemed limitless. After a few minutes, the Elan swept past the island home of the petrels. Next came a series of smaller rocks, just barely peeking out of the surface of the sea. A high tide would almost cover them. The topmost points were covered with a yellow residue. Steam rose when the large wave slapped over them. When she looked at one of the petrels flying over the island, the bird became blurry, as if the air in between was simmering, like the air above a hot fire. "Why does the air shimmer like that?" she asked. "Fumaroles," Omanuju said, "also known as the dragon's breath. When we get closer, you'll notice the smell." Soon the air became foul with the scent of rotten eggs, making Gabriella gag. She had heard sailors talk of such islands. "There are not really dragons sleeping inside, are there?" she asked, her hands tightening on the railing. "Not on these islands," Gede said, turning to the levers beside the ship's wheel. There were some bluefish left over from the day before, which Gede insisted they finish before it went bad. Gabriella mixed it with a few sprigs of rosemary that she found among the other herbs in one of the ship's lockers. Like the biscuits, she did not try to understand how the old herb was, or how it was so well preserved. Omanuju said the airship was ancient, yet the rosemary smelled and looked fresh. She shrugged off the contradiction. She was learning not to question and to just accept the mysteries the Elan presented. "Like blue men and flying ships," she said to herself. "They just are. It's not my job to explain or even understand." It was a mantra she had developed for herself in the past days, her way of coping with things her mind was not able to accept. But this time, Gede overheard her talking to herself. "That's the spirit, lass," he said. "What are the gods but a riddle? What is life but a mystery to be experienced? The only way to understand it is to live it, and even then we'll fall short." "Well said." Omanuju looked up from one of his books. Gabriella had the sense that the philosophical tenets he was reading would be lost on her, and felt it best to keep her mouth shut while Gede still thought her wise. No point in disabusing him of the notion, she thought. Bluefish was a bony fish. After Gabriella had finished lunch, she sat at the stern picking at her teeth with a bone that was thin as nail clipping. She was ready for an afternoon nap, but for a few minutes she reveled in the sight of the clouds gathering behind them to the west. Perhaps she would see more birds. From the Elan, she had learned to love the endless variety of vistas offered by the clouds. At times they formed flat layers that looked like landscapes with the ocean a lake in their midst. Other days, their surfaces bunched and undulated like trees of a forest. Gabriella liked it least when they were within the clouds for any extended time. It was the unrelenting whiteness that disturbed her, as if they had sailed into a void and the world had been erased, or worse, the Elan and her crew had. Colors on the ship seemed to fade, as did the memory of greens, yellows, and deep bright reds. When they emerged from a bank of white clouds, the color of the sea spread below, like deep blue ink spilled from a well. A solitary bird was following in their wake. By its wingspan, Gabriella knew it had to be one of the great seabirds, likely an albatross. She put off her nap a little bit longer, hoping the bird would gain on the Elan so she could identify it. Her brother, Dameon, loved birds. No, he hated the noise they made, but he loved identifying them. He had learned to tell them by their black shapes against the sky. If she had a knack for that, she owed it to him. She knew Dameon would have enjoyed the variety of birds they had seen so far. Gulls, garnets, kestrels, puffins, pelicans, and petrels, and so many of them. She stopped herself short of admitting it would have been worth bringing him along. Already the trip had been far too dangerous, and she was enjoying her freedom far too much. It would be enough to tell him about the bird she saw when she returned to Harkness. Perhaps then he might even be cured, and she would be able to converse with him like other boys his age. The movement of the bird's wings was strange. So was the shape. If she did not know better, she would say the wings looked bat-like, but Gabriella figured that was a trick of the distance. After a while, she grew excited. It was not an albatross or storm petrel, but something new, an unknown species. The neck was long like a pelican, but the beak looked like a duck's. The tail, too, was strange, long and flailing as opposed to flared. She had once seen a stuffed bird from the southern continent, where there was no winter, only summer year-round. That specimen had brilliant plumage, as if it were glazed, and a long streaming tail that swung behind it. This bird, to their stern, must be a bird like that, she concluded. As it moved closer, she could see the sun reflecting off its body like glass. She gave up on guessing. She thought of asking Omanuju, but he was engrossed in his books, trying to glean what he could on Nicomedes and what lay ahead of them. She was reluctant to ask Gade, because she suspected he would realize she had nothing to do but watch birds, and the skipper would be quick to find a chore for her to do. Whether it was practicing knots, gutting fish, or scrubbing the deck. But curiosity eventually got the best of her, so she climbed the companion ladder to the mid-deck to find Gade. He was leaning far back in his seat, his feet propped up on an overturned pail, his fingers laced together behind his head. His eyes were closed, and she would have thought him asleep if his lids had not been open, just a crack at the sound of her footsteps. His golden eyes caught the sunlight like bright jewels. "Yes, ma'am. Looking for a task." "Perhaps. I never thought adventuring could be so boring. But right now, I'm vexed as to what type of bird that is astern. My brother is much better at categorizing than demon's feet," Gade cried, turning in his chair and nearly falling from it. He swung his legs to right himself, then pounded on the deck with his fist. "Omanuju, you'll want to stow your books." He checked over the levers and the wheel, then raced from the bow to stern, tightening knots and locking hatches, leaving Gabriella alone on the mid-deck, wondering what it was she had said. All the while, Gade was constantly checking over his shoulder. His brow furrowed as the bird grew as it came closer. Omanuju folded back a page and closed his book. "What is it, Gade?" "The girl is bad luck. A magnet for fiends she is," Gade spat, nodding astern. Omanuju looked to the bird and went rigid. "Is that what I think?" "Indeed," Gade said, securing a line to a cleat. "Farthest west I've ever seen one." "Seen what?" Gabriella asked, but her companions acted as if she had not spoken at all. "She may have saved our lives, spotting it when she did," Omanuju said. "Don't count us saved just yet." Gade returned to the wheel and yanked the lever. The ship pitched upward at such a sudden and steep angle that both Omanuju and Gabriella had to catch themselves on rigging to keep from falling. "You best be strapped into the sickness seating," Gade said, as he raced along the mid-deck, flipping locks and pulling open two hatches. Gabriella thought at first they were stowage lockers, but the undersides of the doors revealed wooden seats and footwells. Leather belts hung from the shoulders of the chairs, and Gade gestured for her to strap herself into one. "All secure at Amantis," Omanuju called, running back to the stern. "Don't dawdle," Gade said as Gabriella climbed down into one of the seats. He planted a foot next to her elbow and tightened the harness around her. "I can already feel those sylphs are not far off, and this will bring them running." "Sylphs? Those black things from the pots on Harkness. They are back?" "They grow larger when they feed on our fear." Gade checked the buckle at her waist. "Whose fear? I'm not scared of a bird." Gade clicked his tongue. "You will be." Omanuju slammed the double doors to the cabin, locked them, and scrambled up the slanted deck to take his place beside Gabriella, strapping himself into his own harness. The air had grown noticeably colder as they climbed, and Gabriella wished she had her cloak. She was sickened by their increasing height, but did not understand the panic of her companions. "Omanuju, what is going on?" "Well," he said, testing his harness, "Gade is right. We did not expect to see any until we were well past Foyle Island. This one is far afield. Must be a wandering male." "Male what?" Her stomach lurched as Gade pulled the nose of the ship higher. The air was biting cold now, and Gabriella's teeth began to chatter. Omanuju swallowed and paused. "I'm not sure how to explain this exactly." "How well do you know your species of dragon, lassie?" Gade asked from behind them. "Ever heard of a wyvern?" Her bowels felt watery. Omanuju answered for her. "Wyverns. They have the largest wings of any dragon. They are the long flyers of the species, like albatrosses among birds. Unlike all other types of dragon with 6 limbs, 4 legs, and 2 wings, wyverns have only 4 limbs, 2 legs, and 2 immense wings. They do not possess the gift of speech like high dragons." "Careful, old man. The girl has gone whiter than my shrouds," Gade said. Gabriella blinked her eyes and did her best to focus. She believed she was awake, so this was not a dream, even if it felt like one. She turned, twisting against her harness, praying that this was still some sort of joke. Another test, perhaps. But the wyvern had drawn closer. Gabriella was stunned. The long spiked tail, the bat-like wings, the jaw she had mistaken for a duck's bill, the metallic glint of scales had come into focus. "How could I have been so stupid? I thought they were just in fairy stories," she heard herself say. "Just like bodiless demons trapped in clay pots?" Gade laughed bitterly. "Like blue men in flying ships," she said sullen. "What is life but a mystery?" "Sorry, lass. You get the bad with the good." Omanuju reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I'm sorry, Gabriella. I meant to tell you." She remembered her own statements in the House of Healing, her insistence of what everyone knew to be true, that dragons were not real. "I'm such a fool." "We'll be all right. Gade knows what he is doing." "I hope," she thought to herself. The snap of the wyvern's wings could now be heard over the wind. The creature was close enough that Gabriella could make out overlapping teeth at the edges of its mouth. She squeezed Omanuju's hand tighter. As she did so, a new awareness came over her like a cold spot on the inside of her skull. She recognized the feeling this time, remembering it from the day they left Harkness. "The sylphs," she said. "I can feel them." "I can too," Omanuju said. "They have grown strong off our own fear." "Does that mean you are scared too?" "Yes." The elan was pitched so dramatically now that standing on the deck would have been impossible. Supplies tumbled against one another in the storage lockers below decks. She fought with herself not to look astern. Instead, she focused on the clear, bright sky and the thin ceiling of wispy clouds scuttling above. A wind shook them as they passed through the lair. Gabriella was lying back in her seat now, her feet almost level with her head when she heard a loud cry off the port quarter. Gabriella knew it was impossible to pretend any longer. She turned, any movement difficult with the straps pressing on her chest and lap. She would have thought it impossible for a lizard to fly, but she saw that, despite the heavy scales, the wyvern was clearly a creature of the air. The wings were wide and translucent. The movement of his neck and limbs was fluid and graceful, much like a swan. The scales shimmered with an almost vain quality. The wyvern was a perfect balance of beauty and terror, like an executioner's sword encrusted with rubies and pearls. Just as it was clear it was a creature of flight, it was also a predator. Its claws were long and sharp, teeth crowded in its mouth like a shark's. The luminous eyes were full of a hunter's malice. Was it the fear making her lightheaded, or the altitude? The Elan had never punched through such high clouds, which spread all around, like stretched cotton replacing the sea. This second tier of the sky was frigid despite the overpowering sun. Gabriella trembled. She crossed her arms over her chest. Omanuju took low, slow breaths in the thinning air. Gabriella felt as if she had just run for miles, over the starboard quarter. Like two stains on a tablecloth pulsed the sylphs. "I'm so sorry, Omanuju. I did not mean to be afraid. You can help that as much as you can help being human," he said. "I'm scared as well, and I can imagine even Gade is scared." "Fear is useless in a storm," Gade said from behind them. "It needs to go overboard like ballast." "Gade, will the sylphs affect the wyvern as well?" Her teeth were now chattering. "It is the other way around. Those demons are likely to avoid our friend down there." Gade cast another look back over his shoulder. "Why?" she wheezed. "Because dragons are full of magic. Some of that magic can be powerfully destructive, even to the bodiless like the sylph." Gabriella tried to concentrate on Gade's words, but it was becoming difficult. Her body was shaking. She noticed a film of white frost forming in Omanuju's whiskers. "That's the thing about dragons," Gade said, his tone speculative. "They are the highest, most superior form of physical life on this little ball of earth. The perfect blending of magic and flesh. Amazing, really, and quite intelligent." "Intelligent enough to be reasoned with?" Gabriella asked, hope building in her chest. "Not wyverns. They can be dumb beasts. Killing and eating is what they do. Big flying barracudas, that's all they are." "I think I would definitely be less afraid of a barracuda." Gade continued almost as if he were talking to himself. "It is a case where greater intelligence does not necessarily equal a better being. I mean, you humans have language and brains, but look what you do with them. Not a wyvern. They just are what they are. A wyvern just is. A lot to be learned from that." "Gade?" Gabriella asked. The cold was becoming so terrible that Gabriella only ached to be warm again, even if that meant descending and facing both the sylph and the wyvern. The ship's wooden boards popped and moaned as they contracted in the cold. "Gade, aren't you cold?" "No, but I bet you are. This is as high as we can go, I reckon, before you black out." "Thank the stars," Omanuju added, his head swaying as if he were drunk. Gade leapt from his seat and dropped the sails. He moved over the sloping boards as if gravity did not affect him. Or maybe he had his own gravity that kept him glued to the deck of the Elan. Gabriella tried turning to see if the pursuers were gaining, but the effort made her sight dim. She heard Gade climb back into his seat. After a deep breath, the blackness receded from the edges of her vision. Gade's blue hand clutched the black lever, one she had not noticed before. She was not sure if it was the thin air or if what she saw was true. The end of the lever was carved in the shape of a skull. "Hold on!" With a heave, Gade swung the lever forwards. Gears shifted below the mid-deck. Hidden wheels turned. The Elan fell, but not just a slight dip. It plummeted as a ship in the sky ought to. "Gade has flipped the stone," Omanuju yelled over the wind, and Gabriella had a vision of the great black stone slowly turning over in the hull below them, its gravity-banishing quality reversed. "The topside does not repel us from the earth." Gabriella did not need an explanation. They fell out of the sky like an anchor. She screamed, lost consciousness, came to, and watched in silent horror as they passed through the layer of highest clouds, and the sea reappeared below them. Now she was terribly awake. The rush of air over the deck was more powerful than any gale wind she had ever experienced. Her hair snapped and flailed around her like black flames. She would have screamed again if she did not have to use so much effort to pull the shooting air into her lungs. This was air turned solid with the force of water, pushing and twisting her body. Even as it shot past, she felt it growing thicker. Gade pressed one of the pedals. The Elan pitched nose down. Over the bow, an island swung into view. It was rocky and flat, with wide canyons cutting it apart. The wind had reached a certain ferocity and remained constant. Gabriella no longer felt as if she was pulled against her harness. She felt oddly weightless. She strained again to turn and look for the wyvern and the sylphs. Gade must have wondered where they were, too. He pushed the pedals, the side sails flapped. The Elan dipped and spun around once more. Now they were falling stern first, wobbling as they did. Beyond the bow railing, the Wyvern was dropping, his wings folded like a bird of prey. Behind him, spiraling like funnel clouds, were the sylphs. Gade spun the ship back around. The island and the sea moved closer. Gabriella did not know if she liked this view any better. The island was large, and she hoped they might be able to find a place to hide. But they were also set to fall into the sea a quarter of a league away. She wondered if that was Gade's plan, and he had just shown mercy in not sharing it with her. A sudden death, splintered to bits and then sinking into the abyss, was preferable to death by wyvern and sylph combined. They fell for a minute longer, and Gabriella, still lightheaded, contemplated the seals sunning themselves on the rocks along the shore. Their pups splashed in and out of a kelp forest bobbing in the waves. How she envied them their leisure, their ignorance of pure terror. Gade broke her out of her reverie. "Hold on!" He threw the levers to the left of the wheel forward. Machinery wheeled and groaned. The Elan changed pitch and direction abruptly. Gabriella was crushed into her seat, then flung backwards so that her head struck the high back of the chair. They were falling, but at an angle, as if they had been scooped out of their fall. Their momentum shot them forward, like a rock from a catapult. There was a sound of rippling canvas. Gade had pulled another lever. This one turned the panel of sails parallel to the deck. The canvas between the joists was taut with the flow of air. The sail had become a wing, and the Elan a glider, one moving at a tremendous speed. The air felt more solid than ever. Its flow was holding them aloft. Gabriella wondered if they would be able to escape entirely, but the pursuit was not yet over. The wyvern spread his own wings, executed a tight half-loop, and flapped quickly to catch up with them. "Go, Gade! He is gaining!" "This rig only coasts, darling." Gade kicked a pedal and swung the Elan to starboard as the wyvern took a swipe at the port quarter. "And dodges. I can't speed her up." Gade steered them toward the island, where Gabriella could make out the beckoning mouth of a canyon, a delta shimmering in the sunlight. They were close enough to the island that the barks of the seals playing in the kelp and the hiss of a sea wash surged up to them. Gabriella could also hear the thwomp of the wyvern's wings snapping greedily, scooping air in as it chased the Elan. The predator desperately wanted to reach them before they slipped between the canyon walls. Had it arms, it could have grabbed hold of the rear of the ship. The wyvern was so close that Gabriella could see the cracks of its talons and the arteries pumping with blood in the thin membrane of its wings. Gade heard the creature's wings and pushed the skull-top lever back into its original place. The Elan floated as the rock was turned and the ship shot upwards. For a moment, it seemed to sit in with the air motionless. Now the wyvern was below and replaced near the stern by twin descending clouds of black. Gade jammed the lever forward again. The stone flipped once more, and the Elan dropped. There was a thud and a screech as the wyvern crashed into the hull. Gabriella prayed that they split its skull, but the spiked tail retaliated, snapping up over the side and striking the deck. Boards splintered as if an axe had fallen. Gade reacted, spinning the ship on its axis so that it shot out sideways from between their pursuers. Then the wyvern and the sylphs collided in a brilliant moment. The sylphs exploded outwards, while the wyvern flailed wildly at their substance. They broke into 1,000 globules, like oil and water. Gabriella prayed to the gods that the wyvern and sylphs would destroy each other. But the globules coalesced into their full self forms and continued their descent, like ink poured from a spout. Clear of the sylphs, the wyvern flapped vigorously to regain his lost position in the race. The walls of the canyon rose higher on either side of the Elan. The seals and their pups let out high-pitched barks of panic as the wyvern neared. The rocks became bare as the animals frantically abandoned their perches for the water as the sylphs rushed into the canyon, their shapes now twisted black ribbons. Panicked petrels flew from the canyon cliffs. The Elan crashed into a tree that clung to the rocks. It snapped free and landed on the deck. A shadow from above covered it, the wyvern blocking out the sun. Gade cursed, stomped the pedal. Gears rolled, and the Elan turned completely sideways and shot off into a narrower gorge. Gabriella was thrown roughly back and forth in her seat. She felt as if she were being tousled by bullies. She had the growing sense that they were losing control and, worse, momentum. They were dropping quickly. Gade attempted to compensate by turning the stone sideways to keep the Elan's weight neutralized. The wyvern snaked between the walls, weaving and dodging with impossible ease. Gabriella felt dizzy and nauseous. Sickness seeding, she thought wryly. The sun burst out around them once more as they shot into a new branch of the river, this one tranquil like a lagoon. Gade turned the ship sharply. Gabriella and Omanuju were flung across their seats and against their straps. Their last turn had drained the airship's momentum. Bruised and shaken, Gabriella shrank in her seat as a wyvern torn the stern railing away with its claws. The sound of rushing water made her face forward again. Ahead, the canyon ended abruptly in a wall of white falling water, plummeting into a wide lake encircled by sheer rock walls made black by the churning shapes of the sylphs. The sylphs reached out, their tendrils making a spider web to snag the Elan. Gade steered the ship towards the base of the waterfall. Gabriella tried to comprehend what the skipper was doing. Maybe, if they survived the impact, the water would protect them from the sylphs. But would that help with the dragon? The sylphs poured themselves downward, onto the deck into pools that surged toward Gabriella and Omanuju. She could feel her life force draining out of her. But the falling water rushed over them, hammering the planks of the ship. The sylphs disappeared like steam swept away by wind. The water passed over Gabriella, slapping her in the face. Her senses returned, just in time to feel the crash, she thought. But the crash did not come. The water moved like a curtain over and behind them. The ship shuddered as it scraped its bottom on stone. The Elan spun around in a circle, and Gabriella watched cavern walls go by in a blur until the ship slowed its spinning and came to a halt in a dark cave. To Gabriella's relief, the opening of the cave was completely concealed by the falling water. She jumped as a waterfall flashed red. A winged shadow passed before it, then disappeared. The wyvern did not seem willing to brave the water either. Gabriella lifted her head and turned around them. The floor was flagstone, and the walls of the cavern had been shaped neatly into right angles. She could see doorways and iron rings for holding torches. Windows had been cut into walls, and she caught sight of furniture, tables, stools, benches, and even shelves lined with books. "Good thing wyverns and sylphs don't like water much." "Gade, once again you have proven yourself invaluable," Omanuju said, his hair a mess from the wind and water. "Thank the Elan. She has done us well." "Gabriella," Omanuju said in a soft voice, "you can let go your belts now." She realized her hands were still clenched around her own harness, her fingernails gouging small crescent moons into her shoulder straps. It was difficult to make her hands relax. They had been tensed so long. "Where are we?" she asked. Gade spread his arms wide, his face the picture of satisfaction. "Welcome to Nicomedes' secret workshop." Chapter 15. Nicomedes' Workshop. Gade slid down the deck and leapt over the railing. He patted the hull of the ship, as a proud owner might a horse. Gabriella was hanging by her straps. She unbuckled herself, then helped Omanuju from his seat. He clambered over the slanted deck to the cabin and yanked at the doors. The ship had settled unevenly, and Gabriella rushed over to help force the doors open. The cabin floor was covered with unrolled scrolls. A sextant, a compass, a sewing kit, and all manners of items had fallen from the cupboards. Rivulets of ink dribbled down across the tilted floor from a shattered inkwell. Adamantus had anchored himself beneath the navigation table. The elk's antlers were dug into the underside of the table, and his legs folded around the narrow plinth that held the table up in its center. His fur was splattered with ink, and a map was speared on the end of one of his antlers. Gabriella slid the map carefully from his antler, trying to avoid ripping it further. "What a terrible mess," Gabriella said. "I'll take this over being wyvern food," Omanuju said. After all the rocking, dipping, and other evasive maneuvers, the elk was well stuck in place. It took both Omanuju and Gabriella to dislodge his antlers from the table. When they did, the elk slid across the floor, his hooves scraping the planks as he tried to stand. He swayed as if drunk until he could clomp towards the open doors and bound out through them. He continued to skitter across the deck, only recovering himself when he leapt the railing and stepped onto level ground. Gabriella followed him but hesitated at the rail of the ship. The white wall of water at the mouth of the cave lit up again in reds and oranges, a window of stained glass. The wyvern is still outside. He's breathing fire at the falls. He can spit all he wants, Gayday said next to a yawning gash in the hull where a board had been sheared away. But he won't get through, not unless he uses mage fire, and I reckon he won't find us worth that. Mage fire? Gabriella repeated. Before she could ask what it was, a second, more pertinent question arose in her mind. And the sylphs? Spent, Omanuju said, the relief in his voice clear. The manifestation they took just outside the falls would have required a great deal of strength for them. Since they did not catch us, it will take them some time to recover their energies. They are not gone for good, but they are gone for a while. The immediate danger passed. Gabriella climbed out of the elan, breathed out a deep sigh, and rolled her shoulders. They were still sore from the harnesses. Her eyes were drawn towards Adamantus, who stood silhouetted by water and fire. In that instant, he seemed as magical and wondrous as the wyvern, two mysterious, magical beasts gazing through a window of falling water. One as gentle as the other was deadly, and yet equal in their grandeur. Gabriella had the sense that the solution to some great mystery was in front of her, but like a baby trying to decipher numbers and letters, the meaning was out of her reach. Only the sense of imminence remained. You see it too? Omanuju asked. Yes, they're wondrous. Indeed. Ahoy, friends! Gayday called from the pier as he walked towards the door and opened it. Stop your gazing and follow your skipper. We have work to do. Inside the room, an eerie green light danced and moved about like the light of a lantern when moths gathered around it. But no lantern Gabriella had ever seen glowed green. If there were lanterns burning, it meant that they were not alone. Gabriella was afraid of who or what they might find in this cave and stopped just short of the doorway. Omanuju stepped next to her and said, Look up. The roof was the source of the light. Although the walls of the room were stone, the ceiling was transparent. It's made of glass, a thick glass, Omanuju said, a clever solution to illuminate an underground workshop. The river runs over it? Yes, just before it drops over the cliff outside. It's beautiful, Gabriella said, mesmerized by the fluid green light above her until the crash on the work table in the center of the room startled her. Gayday had lifted a large chest from the floor and deposited it on the table. It was wood, but unlike the wood of the doors, it did not look weathered or old. The box was sealed with a formidable-looking lid that was ringed with gargoyle faces. Each little creature was carved with exquisite detail, but the one thing the gargoyles had in common was wide-open mouths, revealing small numbered dials. The room was packed full with benches and tables, the walls lined with sets of hanging tools, including wrenches and screwdrivers, and other items Gabriella could not name. Shelves of glass drawers held screws, nails, nuts, bolts, and pulleys. There was a clear order to the tools, each arranged according to size in neat rows. The same order guided the smaller items in the drawers. Even the stools under the benches were arranged in sequence of smallest to largest. This was really where Nicomedes worked? Gabriella asked. Yes, Omanuju said, at least in his later life, when some of the members of the Dis nobility had grown corrupt and Nicomedes had become suspicious of them. He decided to bring his work here, to keep it secret from those who might use it for nefarious ends. All his life, Nicomedes had used his gifts to serve the needs of the people of Dis. Omanuju lifted a screwdriver and blew the dust off it. He brought clean water to people's houses, found ways to manage the sanitation needs of Dis, and made machines for transporting heavy goods so that the men and women would not strain themselves carrying heavy loads. He found ways to improve the navigation of ships and how to make them safer. He designed roads to accommodate heavy traffic safely. He invented new ways to store grains, milks, and cornmeal so they did not spoil. He improved filters so almost any water could be made safe to drink. He did so much, and he just gave it away? Nicomedes believed that technology, like wealth, should be shared by all. Omanuju looked at Gabriella. His work made him a hero. He was loved by people all over the kingdom for his generosity and was close friends with the king of Dis. But what happened? Why does this place seem abandoned? When the king's son, Sylar, took the throne, he fell under the influence of the mages, of a cruel and greedy empire, one that used the power of magic to rule its people. The mages guarded the secrets of their magic jealously. They wanted Nicomedes to do the same with his technology, and they wanted him to make weapons for conquest. The mages did not like that he shared his inventions and how he worked with the people. They believed secrecy should veil all power. Omanuju put down the screwdriver and walked over to the drawers, idly opening one and then another. By the time he reached his twilight, Nicomedes had accumulated a great fortune in books and treasure. The books he had sought out, but the treasure had often been given to him out of thanks. He had always intended to leave his library and his treasure to the people of Dis, but as he aged, he knew that the mage's influence over Sylar had grown, and Nicomedes was afraid that after his own death, all he had created would fall into their hands. So he hid everything in his tower over the city, and he surrounded that tower with a labyrinth full of traps that required knowledge to defeat, not magic. Gabriella's eyes roved about the room, mesmerized by the green light dancing on the walls. Gade mentioned the labyrinth. Is there something here that will help us through? Is that why we are here? Gade patted the chest. One step ahead of you, lassie. The map to the labyrinth is inside this chest. He rubbed the dust from the gargoyle faces to reveal the numbered dials in their mouths. Each dial could be turned to the numbers 0 through 9. Are you certain this is the box? Omanuju asked, running his hand over the lid. Pretty certain, Gade said, not looking up as he fiddled with the dials. Gabriella did not bother asking how he knew. It was another thing she was learning to take on faith as far as Gade was concerned. The box was made of dark cherry-stained wood. The fastenings and corners were a bright white metal that mysteriously had retained its sheen over the centuries, unlike the other trunks and boxes resting on the floor, which looked tarnished and worn. The wood was carved with lifelike sunflowers, pine cones, pineapples, and nautilus shells, a collection of mismatched objects that seemed somehow familiar to Gabriella, but she couldn't recall where she had seen them paired together before. Gade began clicking the numbers into place. He confidently moved from one dial to the next, making a circuit of the box. When he had clicked each into place, he put his hands on the lid and took a deep breath. Gabriella sensed he was pausing for the sake of drama. With a flourish, he moved to open the chest. It remained shut. A wry smile formed at the corner of Gade's mouth, and he chuckled. He pushed on the lid harder. It did not budge. He checked the combination, his exasperation building. He tried the lid again. Blast it, he cursed. I thought I had figured it out for sure. Gabriella sat dejectedly on a stool. Apparently, there was a limit to Gade's knowledge. He took a second look at the box and suddenly froze. He waved Omanuju over to his side. There is a plate here with writing. It's runes. Gabriella could not read it, but Omanuju could. It says, the combination, worthy friend, is of numbers that are not of numbers. Well, that seems singularly unhelpful, Gade said. When are numbers not of numbers? Omanuju squinted at the shapes of the chest, running his fingers over them. He smiled. Perhaps numbers are not of other numbers when they are in nature. Look at these items. Each of them is governed by the sequence of sums. Sequence of sums? Gabriella asked. Gade shrugged his shoulders, but Omanuju went to one of the workbenches rummaging around until he found a quill. Gabriella, bring me a blank scroll and a well of ink, would you? She ran to the Elan, clambered over the gunwale and up the listing deck to the cabin doors. She shuffled through the mess of parchments in the cabin for a blank one and retrieved an intact inkwell from one of the stowage cases. When she returned, Omanuju was counting out the seeds in the face of one of the sunflowers on the chest. Each spiral of seeds on the face of the sunflower has the same amount of seeds in them. The first spiral had 8, the next 13, the next 21. the next 34. This is true of sunflowers in nature, as well as on the box. Each number in the sequence is a sum of the two numbers before it. Same for spines of a pine cone and the pattern on a pineapple, even the nautilus shell. If you bisect it and draw a grid over those lines, it's always the same sequence. Omonuju began to write numbers on the parchment Gabriella had brought. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. But how do we know where to start? Which gargoyle is first? Gabriella asked. On their heads. There are runes that say first, second, third, and so on, Gede said. He pointed out the first gargoyle. Fortunately, the numbers on the dials were ones Gabriella could read. Runes were ancient, even in Nicomedes' time. But Gabriella could see why the inventor would use two numbering systems. Only someone who was very learned would have knowledge of both. Learning took patience, and as her father would say, patience begets wisdom. Hadn't Omonuju said Nicomedes would only want someone with wisdom to reach his treasure? She suspected that was what he had meant by a worthy friend in the inscription. She set the dials into place as Omonuju calculated the sums. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, 233, 377, 610, 987, 1,597, 2,584, 4,181, 6,765, and so on. When all 36 dials were set, Gede tried the lid. It did not budge. They checked their math. It was perfect. They reset all the locks and started without including 0. No luck. Gabriella dropped her chin to her chest. She felt as if she had failed a test. Actually, she felt worse. How many dangers had they narrowly escaped? How many leagues had they sailed to be stymied by a box? Gede must have felt the same way, for he slapped the box like one would a malfunctioning maze grinder or dock winch. Well, there are only a few thousand more permutations to try, he said. And tens of thousands of combinations of those, Omonuju added, slumped on his stool. Gabriella considered the riddle on the top of the box. Numbers not of other numbers. Well, their numbers were certainly of other numbers, since they had been sums. She realized they probably could not have been more wrong. The decorations had led them astray, which perhaps they had been meant to do. Gede picked a few tools from the walls and began working at the hinges of the box. This might take a while, he said, a minuscule screwdriver clenched in his teeth. Gabriella pushed back from the table and wandered through the doorway into the next room. Scale models of machines stood on desks. Some were so large that they rested on the floor, waiting for someone to complete them. Gabriella could recognize the function of some. A digging machine with dirt scoops, a self-propelled wheelbarrow, even a floating ship like the Elan, but this one with folded wings on the sides. She wandered into the room's recesses where she found models covered with sheets. Why are these covered? Gabriella peeked under one sheet. Beneath were gears, armor, and blades. Not just sword blades, but rounded blades made for spinning, made for killing. She shuddered and walked to a drafting desk in the corner, where she found a sketch of another machine with whirling blades and bellows for launching darts with a gust of air. This machine had wheels. On the lip of the desk, where there was a small writing lead encased in wood, a pencil, very expensive and rare. She was about to take it when she noticed teeth marks on it. Probably Nicomedes' own tooth marks. The inventor felt close in that moment and very real. The words, worthy friend, came back to her. She knew Nicomedes was long gone, but she could sense his presence powerfully here, which was why she left the pencil where she found it. This place was not a tomb, but it felt just as sacred. She knew she wanted something from Nicomedes, and she felt a need to behave as if she were worthy of it. Machines for killing from a man of peace, Omonuju said beside her. She had not been aware of his coming into the room, but after seeing the way he moved on Kajil, it did not surprise her that he could move quickly and silently, even right next to her. He must have felt like he was in great danger. That is why he must have come here, Gabriella said. She examined the marks on the pencil. She knew she bit down on quills when frustrated, adding up sums for school. I don't think he liked designing these machines. I think that is why he covered up the models with a sheet, she ventured. He did not want to be reminded. As they uncovered more drawings and lifted more tarps, Gabriella felt Nicomedes' personality revealing itself. The next room presented row upon row of bookshelves. Although they were dusty, the books sat neatly arranged and catalogued. In the corner of the room, waiting in a wide beam of dancing waterlight, it was a well-worn reading chair with an equally worn footstool. Gabriella thought about the hours the inventor must have sat here, reading, thinking, dreaming. The next room was the kitchen. Like the workroom tools, the pots were all aligned according to size. Forks, knives, and spoons rested in designated cubby holes, while goblets and plates were evenly spaced on a series of shelves. Nicomedes' bedroom was last. Gabriella stopped at the doorway when she saw the bed, fearful that his remains would be moldering there. But the bedclothes were empty and clean, the corners of the blankets tucked under the mattress as if waiting for Nicomedes to return, leaving Gabriella with a sense of sadness. This room was just beside the waterfall, and in addition to the skylight, there was a large bay window looking out into the lagoon. The window glass was clouded with age, but for some effort, Gabriella was able to turn the latch and push the window open. The sound and smell of the cascading water flooded the room, a welcome contrast to the tomb-like silence that had permeated the rooms they had passed through. Gabriella could imagine the sounds of falling water soothing a pensive Nicomedes to sleep. The angle of the window allowed her to see around the edge of the falls. The wyvern was still perched on the rocks, but its attention was no longer on the escaped Alon. The dragon was watching the lagoon, its neck curled backwards like a crane when hunting fish. Something caught its eye, and the wyvern leapt off its rocky roost. The falling water blocked her view, but Gabriella heard a small splash. The wyvern flapped back into view, a fat fish in its terrible teeth. Despite her fear of the creature, Gabriella smiled at its successful fishing. "Oh, Manushu, sailors sail east on a regular basis, and stories of dragons are rare. Why have we met this one so easily?" Dragons have always been there, even if they do not venture west much these days. Contrary to popular belief, ocean-going ships do not interest them much. Sailors avoid seas where dragons are common, but they have avoided those lanes so long they forget why. It's likely that dragons have flown over many a sailor only to be mistaken for birds. Why did this dragon pursue us? Well, while ocean-going ships might not interest dragons much, ships of the air are another matter. When we take to the air, we are in the wyvern's domain. They have long memories, and I'm sure they do not fondly recall floating ships in the sky. Gabriella remembered something else Gede had said. "Oh, Manuju, what is mage fire?" Every dragon, wyvern, draghorn, or high dragon breathes fire, the same fire we have burning in our hearths and lamps. But there is a second fire that burns without heat that is actually magical. It is such pure magic that even the most powerful of mages is helpless against it, but it can be used to give a person wisdom or power. Some say it even has healing properties. It is called the mage fire. So, why did the wyvern not use it on us? I suspect because according to legend, a dragon can only use his breath of mage fire once in his whole long life. Truly? Omanuju shrugged. The tales of old say that even high dragons have only one, maybe two breaths of the stuff. A dragon may live a long life of thousands of years and never use it. Some say dragons who have not used it in their lifetime breathe out their last breath with it. Anyone standing before that fire would gain incredible wisdom and insight. Gabriella looked back at the wyvern. The beast sat back and in surprisingly human fashion, bared its teeth, and picked them with one of its talons. "We could use some wisdom now for that pox," Gabriella said. "I never thought this would be so hard on Manuju, but I guess I was just naive." Dameon came to mind again. his penchant for numbers. She remembered the last time she had walked with him after he had fallen into the water, and Mortimer had saved him. He had counted by primes that day to calm himself. Primes were his favorite numbers. Gabriella's body stiffened a moment before she spun around and sprinted back into the workroom, calling over her shoulder, "Oh, Manushu, I've got it! Numbers not of other numbers. Nicomedes means prime numbers." Tools were scattered all about the chest, but Gede had had no luck breaking into it. Gabriella burst into the room just as the skipper threw a miniature hammer and chisel down on the table. "Gede, numbers not of other numbers are prime numbers, not divisible by any regular primes. I had not thought of that." "Help me put them in," she said. Gabriella began clicking the sequence of prime numbers into place. She did fine up until the 60s. Then she had to slow down. By the time she had come up with 101, her head was hurting. Now, she did wish Dameon were there, if only for this. How could she be sure of any of the numbers? She wondered if her brother was not a little magic himself to be able to come up with them so effortlessly. Omanuju swept into the room, blowing the dust off a book in his hands. He dropped it on the table and flipped the pages until he came to a table with 50 prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31, 37, 41, 43, 47, 53, 59, 61, 67, 71, 73, 79, and so on. Gabriella dialed in the rest. When she finished, she could not bring herself to touch the lid. Her hands were shaking so hard. "Go ahead," Gede said. "You've earned it." She put her hands on the small handles and pushed up. A clicking noise erupted from all the locks as the lid tilted open. Gede let out a loud whoop, but Gabriella restrained her celebration. She wanted to make sure the box did not contain a second set of locks. There were none. The chest was empty except for a single leather folio. Gabriella's head felt light, as if it were full of hot air waiting to float away. She reached in reverently and removed the folio. The leather cover, having been closed for so long, did not want to stay open, so Gabriella held it open with her hand. She shivered with excitement as she handed something she knew Nicomedes only wanted his worthy friends to touch. The folio held a soft piece of vellum that Gede lifted out and unfolded. It was covered with a variety of large symbols arranged in rows and columns, an unconventional map from a genius. It certainly did not look like a drawing of a maze or labyrinth. In the margins was more rune writing. "What does it say?" Gabriella asked. "Follow the signs," Gede and Omanuju said in unison. "That is all?" "Yes," Omanuju nodded. "Another riddle?" Gede examined the folio carefully for any details they might have missed. "No, not a riddle," Omanuju said. "A command. Those figures in the center of the page, they are not characters of any language. They seem to be signs." "But what about the maze? I thought this was a map," Gabriella said, rubbing her temples. Omanuju sighed. "We will just have to see when we reach this."